Jeremy Wallace had never been the kind of man to seek unnecessary conflict. A 45-year-old electrical engineer, he had spent most of his life working with high-voltage systems, backup power solutions, and large-scale energy projects. After a demanding year-long contract in another state, he had finally returned home, eager to settle back into a routine that didn't involve constant travel and hotel rooms. His house, a sturdy, two-story building on a quiet suburban street, wasn't anything extravagant, but it was his. After years of renting, Jeremy had purchased the property 5 years ago, drawn in by its solid structure, spacious backyard, and potential for energy efficiency. One of the first things he did upon returning was invest in solar panels. He had been planning the upgrade for months, researching the best systems, comparing inverters, and calculating his projected savings. As someone who had spent decades optimizing electrical systems, he saw no reason why his own home shouldn't be as energy independent as possible. After coordinating with a trusted installation company, the panels were finally in place, sleek, modern, perfectly aligned on his roof, collecting sunlight and converting it into clean, renewable power. Jeremy had set up a monitoring system that allowed him to track energy production in real time, optimizing his household's consumption and ensuring he got the most out of his investment. At first, everything seemed fine. The installation had gone smoothly, the system was running efficiently, and his utility bill was already reflecting the benefits. But then he started noticing little things that didn't sit right. His neighbor Karen had always been an overly involved, opinionated woman, the type of person who acted like the entire neighborhood was her personal kingdom. She was in her early 50s, a widow who spent most of her time organizing pointless community meetings, submitting complaints to the city about minor inconveniences, and peering through her curtains whenever something slightly out of the ordinary happened on their street. Jeremy had never had major issues with her before, though he had heard plenty of stories from other neighbors about her interference in their lives. Complaints about how someone's garbage bins were too visible, letters left on doorsteps regarding excessive noise, and aggressive lectures about property aesthetics were just part of the Karen experience. She had approached Jeremy a few times in the past, making passive-aggressive comments about the motion sensor lights he had installed on his driveway, claiming they were unnecessarily bright, and disturbing the nighttime ambience of the neighborhood. Now she seemed fixated on his solar panels. The day after installation, she had stopped him while he was unloading groceries from his car. "Quite the addition you've got there," she had said, arms crossed, standing just inside the invisible but well-understood boundary between their properties. Jeremy had merely nodded, not particularly interested in discussing his personal investments with her. "Yeah, should save me a lot on electricity." Karen pursed her lips as if he had said something offensive. "I just hope you checked with the homeowner's guidelines. Some of us care about the overall look of the neighborhood." Jeremy resisted the urge to sigh. "It's a private installation. No guidelines prevent it." Karen had let out a small, dismissive noise. "Well, solar panels should benefit the whole community, don't you think? Not just one house. Maybe you should have considered joining a shared grid project instead of going completely independent." Jeremy didn't even dignify that with a response. He had turned back to his groceries, mentally filing the conversation away as yet another one of Karen's unnecessary intrusions. He had assumed that would be the end of it, just another neighbor with too much free time and too many opinions. But as the week went on, he started seeing Karen more frequently than usual. She would be outside whenever he was, tending to her already perfectly arranged flower beds, standing at the edge of her driveway with her phone in hand, or simply watching. Every time he glanced up, she was there, eyes flicking toward his roof before quickly looking away. Then came the second conversation. This time she caught him while he was adjusting the settings on his monitoring app while standing on his porch. "I've been looking into solar panels," she said without preamble, stepping onto his walkway uninvited. "They're quite expensive, aren't they?" Jeremy set his phone down, already bracing for whatever nonsense she was about to bring up. "Depends on the system. Long-term savings make up for it." Karen nodded slowly, her gaze shifting from him to the roof and back again. It's just interesting, how much energy a system like that can generate. More than one person really needs. Jeremy didn't like where this was going. It's sized to fit my household's usage. Karen smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Must be nice to have all that power to yourself. Some of us could really use a break on our energy bills. That was when Jeremy understood exactly what she was getting at. She wasn't just being nosy, she was laying the groundwork for some kind of ridiculous request or demand. He wasn't sure what annoyed him more, the entitlement or the sheer nerve of it. Solar panels aren't something you just share, Karen, he said evenly. They're tied directly into my home's electrical system. That's how they work. Karen tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Oh, I'm sure there are ways around that. Jeremy didn't humor her with a response. He simply walked back inside, leaving her standing on his property with that unsettling, knowing look on her face. That night, for the first time since installing the panels, he felt uneasy. It was irrational. Karen was annoying, but she wasn't a criminal. Still, something about her behavior nagged at him, a persistent itch in the back of his mind that refused to go away. The feeling only grew stronger the next morning when he stepped outside to get his mail and noticed something strange. The solar panels were gone. Not damaged, not vandalized, just missing. For a moment, he thought he was imagining things. His brain struggled to process the sight of his perfectly intact roof, now bare where the panels had been securely installed just the day before. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again, but the result was the same. They weren't there. There were no tools left behind, no shattered glass, no signs of a struggle, just the clean, precise absence of thousands of dollars worth of solar technology. Jeremy's stomach dropped. This wasn't random vandalism. This wasn't the work of some bored teenagers. Someone had professionally removed his solar panels, and they had done it quietly, efficiently, and without a single alarm being triggered. The worst part? He already had a very good idea of who was behind it. Jeremy stood frozen on his porch, his mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of what had happened. He had spent years working in the energy sector, designing electrical infrastructure for large-scale industrial projects, yet he had never encountered a theft executed with such precision. Whoever had taken his solar panels wasn't just some opportunistic thief looking to make a quick buck. They knew exactly what they were doing. This was a planned job, carried out with efficiency and skill. But how? And more importantly, why? His first instinct was to check his security system. He hurried back inside, grabbed his tablet, and pulled up the footage from his outdoor cameras. As the video loaded, his pulse quickened. The feed showed nothing out of the ordinary until around 2:30 in the morning. That was when the streetlights flickered slightly, a barely perceptible dimming that lasted no more than a second. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, except Jeremy recognized the telltale sign of a brief power fluctuation. He immediately suspected that whoever had stolen his panels had momentarily disrupted the local electrical supply, possibly using a portable EMP device or an intentional short in a nearby transformer to temporarily disable his cameras. When the feed resumed, the roof was already bare. The panels were gone, and not a single frame of footage showed how it had happened. Jeremy clenched his jaw. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. It was calculated, methodical, and intentional. Still, he wasn't completely without options. While his cameras had failed, his solar system was equipped with real-time monitoring software. He logged into the interface and navigated to the GPS tracking feature, one of the many security measures he had insisted on when selecting his system. Most people wouldn't bother with tracking, but Jeremy knew better. Solar panels were expensive, and they had become a prime target for theft in recent years. As the map loaded, he braced himself, half expecting the panels to be in some scrapyard or loaded onto a truck, heading out of town, but what he saw made his blood run cold. The GPS signal was still active, and the location wasn't some distant industrial site or an underground marketplace. It was less than a mile away on the very same street. Jeremy stared at the blinking dot on the screen. His solar panels hadn't been stolen and sold off. They had been relocated. Someone had taken them off his roof and reinstalled them in another home. He zoomed in on the map, and his stomach twisted as the address became clear. Karen's house. For a moment, he sat in stunned silence, his mind struggling to reconcile the absurdity of the situation. The same woman who had stood in his driveway just days ago, complaining about how his panels should be shared, he had somehow orchestrated the theft and installation of those very same panels onto her own home. The sheer nerve of it was almost admirable in a twisted way. Jeremy's hands tightened around the edges of the tablet. His first instinct was to march over to Karen's house and confront her directly, but he forced himself to take a breath and think rationally. Bursting in unprepared wouldn't accomplish anything. If Karen had gone to the lengths of hiring professionals to steal and reinstall his panels, then she wasn't just an annoying busybody, she was someone who knew how to manipulate situations in her favor. If he confronted her without solid proof, she would deny everything, turn the situation around on him, and probably call the police herself, claiming harassment. No, he needed to be smart. He took screenshots of the GPS location, saving them to multiple devices in case Karen somehow found a way to tamper with the signal. Then, he made a call not to the police just yet, but to his insurance company. The representative on the other end of the line sounded skeptical at first. Stolen solar panels weren't exactly an everyday occurrence, and the idea that they had been relocated down the street was almost too ridiculous to believe. But when Jeremy explained that the panels were still transmitting data, and that he had concrete evidence of their new location, the conversation took a more serious turn. The insurance agent asked him to submit a formal claim and assured him that an investigator would be assigned to the case immediately. Jeremy hung up and considered his next move. He could go to the police, but he knew how this would play out. Without visible signs of forced entry or video footage of the theft, the officers would likely brush it off as a civil dispute rather than a criminal case. Worse, Karen could claim that she had purchased the panels legally, and until Jeremy could prove otherwise, there would be no immediate action taken. He needed more than just GPS data, he needed undeniable evidence. That was when an idea struck him. If Karen had indeed installed his stolen panels onto her house, then they would still be linked to his monitoring system. He pulled up the interface again and checked the energy production logs. Sure enough, the panels were online, generating power. But Karen wasn't an expert in electrical engineering. She wouldn't have known how to fully disconnect the system's remote access capabilities. That meant Jeremy could see everything. He scrolled through the live data, noting each spike and drop in energy output. At that moment, Karen's house was drawing power from the stolen panels, unknowingly feeding information straight back to him that gave him leverage. Taking another calculated step, Jeremy contacted the local energy provider. He explained that he suspected unauthorized modifications had been made to a neighboring property's electrical system and requested a technician to verify the installation. Utility companies took electrical safety seriously, and if Karen had illegally hooked up the stolen panels to her home, it wouldn't take long for them to figure it out. Feeling slightly more in control of the situation, Jeremy decided it was time to make an appearance. He walked over to Karen's house, keeping his expression neutral as he rang the doorbell. There was a brief pause before the door swung open, revealing Karen standing there with that same smug, self-satisfied look she always had. "Jeremy," she said smoothly, as if she had been expecting him. What a surprise. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Karen, where are my solar panels?" She blinked, feigning innocence. "Your panels? What are you talking about?" Jeremy wasn't in the mood for games. "I have GPS tracking on them. I know exactly where they are. And I know you had them installed on your house." Karen's expression didn't falter. If anything, her smile widened. "That sounds like quite the accusation. Do you have any proof?" Jeremy stared at her, resisting the urge to lose his temper. She was too confident, which meant she had already thought of a defense. If he pressed too hard without concrete evidence that couldn't be twisted against him, she would spin the situation in her favor. "I've already filed an insurance claim," he said instead, "and I've contacted the energy company. They'll be sending someone out to inspect your installation. If you've connected stolen panels to your system, they'll know." For the first time, Karen's smile wavered. It was only a flicker, barely noticeable, but Jeremy caught it. She hadn't considered that angle. "Jeremy," she said, her voice taking on a more condescending tone, "you need to be careful about making baseless accusations. I wouldn't want you to get yourself into trouble." He met her gaze evenly. "Neither would I." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway. He didn't need to argue he had set things in motion. Now it was only a matter of time before Karen realized just how deep of a hole she had dug for herself. Jeremy returned to his house, his mind racing as he tried to anticipate Karen's next move. She was arrogant. That much was clear. She hadn't expected him to react so quickly, and she certainly hadn't anticipated that he would have GPS tracking or the ability to monitor the stolen solar panels remotely. That momentary flicker of hesitation on her face when he mentioned the energy company had confirmed she wasn't as untouchable as she wanted to believe. But that didn't mean she would back down easily. People like Karen never did. He needed to stay ahead of her. Confronting her directly hadn't yielded results, but it had served a purpose. It let her know that he wasn't going to let this go. He had already filed the insurance claim, and the utility company would be sending out an inspector, but he had no illusions about how quickly they would act. Bureaucracy moved at a snail's pace, and Karen would use every delay to her advantage. She had already lied straight to his face, and if she felt cornered, she might escalate further. His next step was to make sure she couldn't tamper with the evidence. If Karen realized just how much access he had to the system, she would likely try to cut off the connection or disable the panel's tracking function. He logged back into the monitoring software, double-checking that everything was still operational. The solar panels were still producing power, still feeding electricity into Karen's home, and still transmitting data straight to his account. Then, he made a move Karen wouldn't expect. He adjusted the system settings remotely. By changing the access permissions, he locked her out of the configuration interface. If she or whoever installed the panels tried to modify the system, they would find themselves blocked from making any changes. It was a temporary solution, but it would buy him time. Just as he was finishing up, his phone buzzed. It was an email from his insurance company confirming that they had officially opened an investigation. They would be sending an adjuster within the next few days to assess the situation. That was good news, but he knew that a simple investigation wouldn't be enough. Karen had clearly put some effort into making it seem as though the panels belonged to her. What if she had faked paperwork or bribed someone to look the other way? He needed undeniable proof, something that no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. And then an idea hit him: the installation company. When Jeremy had purchased his solar panels, he had hired a well-reviewed professional service to handle the installation. They had taken photos, recorded serial numbers, and documented every step of the process. If he could get access to those records, he would have hard proof that the panels were originally his. Even better, installation companies often kept detailed documentation for warranty purposes, meaning there was an official record of exactly where those panels had been placed. He pulled up the company's contact information and dialed their number. After a few rings, a customer service representative picked up. "Hello, this is BrightSource Solar Solutions. How can I assist you today?" Jeremy kept his voice calm and professional. "Hi, my name is Jeremy Wallace. I had a solar panel system installed at my property about 2 weeks ago, and I need to access my installation records." "Certainly, sir. May I ask what you need them for?" "There's been an issue with my system, and I need the original documentation, including the serial numbers of the panels." There was a brief pause. "I can definitely help with that. Can you verify your address and the date of installation?" Jeremy provided the details, and after a few moments of typing, The representative responded, "I have your records here. Would you like me to email them to you?" "Yes, please. As soon as possible." "Of course, you should receive them within the next hour." Jeremy thanked the representative and ended the call. That was one more piece of the puzzle falling into place. If Karen had gone so far as to create fake paperwork, she was about to have a serious problem. Now all that was left to do was wait. Or so he thought. That night, Jeremy was woken up by a sound he couldn't immediately place. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, a faint scraping noise, like metal against metal. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding. He stayed still, listening. There it was again. He grabbed his phone and checked his security feed. The cameras facing the front of his house showed nothing unusual, but when he switched to the backyard view, his stomach dropped. A figure was crouched near the fence, partially obscured by shadows. The person was fiddling with something, possibly the gate latch. Jeremy didn't hesitate. He grabbed the flashlight he kept by his nightstand, slipped on his shoes, and moved toward the back door as quietly as possible. He wasn't about to let Karen, or whoever she had sent, get away with whatever they were planning. He stepped outside and clicked on the flashlight, aiming the beam directly at the intruder. "Hey," he barked. The figure flinched and scrambled backward. It was a man mid-40s wearing dark clothes and work gloves. He was holding a tool, some kind of wrench or crowbar. For a split second, their eyes met, and Jeremy saw the flicker of panic before the man turned and bolted. Jeremy didn't bother chasing him. Instead, he focused on what the guy had been messing with. When he reached the fence, he saw that the lock on his backyard gate had been partially cut. Whoever this was, they had been trying to break in. But why? Then it hit him. Karen wasn't just trying to cover her tracks, she was trying to get rid of any evidence that could link her to the theft. Maybe she had realized that Jeremy still had access to the monitoring system. Maybe she had panicked when she found out the energy company was investigating. Either way, she had sent someone to tamper with his property. Jeremy took a deep breath, forcing himself to think clearly. He needed to act fast. He pulled out his phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. When the dispatcher answered, he kept his voice steady. "I need to report an attempted break-in at my property. The suspect fled, but I have security footage." The dispatcher took his information and told him that an officer would be sent out to take a report. It wasn't an emergency, but the fact that he had video evidence would ensure that the police followed up. Jeremy spent the next hour reviewing the footage, saving copies to multiple locations. He knew that the police wouldn't be able to make an arrest based on the video alone, but that wasn't the point. The goal was to create a paper trail. The more official records he had, the harder it would be for Karen to wriggle out of this. By the time the officer arrived, Jeremy had everything ready. He provided a copy of the footage, described what had happened, and made sure to mention the ongoing insurance investigation. The officer took notes, promised to file a report, and left with a copy of the security video. Jeremy locked up his house and sat down, exhausted but satisfied. Karen had made her move, but now he had proof that she was willing to resort to criminal activity to cover her tracks. She wasn't just some entitled neighbor with a superiority complex, she was desperate. And desperate people made mistakes. He wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not when he was so close to exposing everything. Jeremy barely got any sleep after the attempted break-in. Even though the police had taken his report and the security footage was backed up in multiple locations, he knew this wasn't over. If anything, Karen was going to push back even harder now that she realized he wasn't backing down. That was the problem with people like her. They thrived on intimidation, on making people feel powerless. But she had made a mistake when she chose him as a target. Jeremy had spent years working on high-stakes projects where a single miscalculation could cost millions. He knew how to handle pressure. He wasn't going to let a neighborhood busybody outmaneuver him. The next morning, as he sipped his coffee and reviewed the energy production data from his stolen solar panels, he received an email from the solar installation company. Attached were all the documents he had requested, purchase receipts, installation reports, and, most importantly, the serial numbers of each panel. He compared them against the logs from his monitoring system, and they were a perfect match. There was no room for argument now. The panels on Karen's roof were his, and he had the documentation to prove it. Now it was time to use that proof effectively. His first call was to the insurance investigator handling his claim. He forwarded all the documents, along with the GPS tracking data and screenshots of the monitoring logs. The investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Lisa Carter, sounded impressed. "This is more evidence than we usually get in cases like these," she admitted. "Most people don't have GPS tracking on their solar panels." Jeremy didn't feel particularly proud of that. "I work in energy infrastructure. I know how valuable this equipment is." "Well, this will certainly help speed things up on our end," Lisa said. "We'll be escalating this to legal as well. If she refuses to return the panels, we'll file a formal complaint and pursue it through the courts." That was exactly what Jeremy wanted to hear. Karen had stolen from him, and now there was a clear legal pathway to hold her accountable. But he wasn't naive. Legal battles took time, and Karen still had an opportunity to pull more stunts before this was resolved. He needed to make sure she didn't have the upper hand. His next move was to call the local energy provider. He had already submitted a request for them to inspect Karen's unauthorized solar installation, but now he had additional proof that the panels were stolen. The representative he spoke with took it seriously, confirming that an inspection team would be dispatched within the next 48 hours. If they determined that the panels had been installed improperly or were illegally connected to the grid, they would shut them down. Jeremy was counting on that. That afternoon, he noticed Karen standing in her driveway, speaking with two men in work uniforms. He didn't recognize them, but judging by the way they gestured toward her roof, they were either electricians or solar technicians. He had anticipated this. Karen had realized that she was exposed, and now she was scrambling to cover her tracks. She probably called in someone to try and disconnect the panels before the energy company could arrive. Jeremy wasn't going to let that happen. He walked out onto his front porch, making sure she saw him. He didn't say anything, didn't make a scene. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching. Karen glanced in his direction, her expression unreadable, then muttered something to the workers. After a few more moments of discussion, the men packed up their tools and left. Jeremy smirked. She was rattled. Later that evening, he got a call from Lisa. "We heard back from our legal team," she said. "We'll be issuing a demand letter first thing tomorrow. She'll have two options: return the stolen property or face a lawsuit." "Good," Jeremy said. "She's already trying to cover her tracks. I saw her talking to contractors earlier today." Lisa sighed. Typical. People like this always think they can get away with it. But the moment they realize someone's actually fighting back, they panic. Jeremy felt a grim sense of satisfaction. "Let me know the moment you hear anything." The next morning, just as he was finishing his breakfast, his doorbell rang. He opened the door to find a man in a navy blue uniform with an energy company logo stitched onto the chest. Behind him, a second worker was unloading a set of inspection tools from a van. "Mr. Wallace?" the man asked. Jeremy nodded. "We're here to conduct an inspection on a reported unauthorized solar installation in the neighborhood," the man continued. "We understand you are the one who submitted the complaint." "That's correct," Jeremy said. "I also have documentation proving that the panels in question belong to me." The inspector's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That'll be helpful. Mind if we take a look?" Jeremy led them to the edge of his property, where they had a clear view of Karen's roof. The inspector took out a tablet and entered some information before pulling up his own records. After a few moments of reviewing the data, he turned to Jeremy with a serious expression. "These serial numbers match a set of panels that were installed at your address," he confirmed. "And I can already see a few red flags with the way they're connected. We'll need to shut them down for safety reasons. Jeremy nodded, resisting the urge to smile. I appreciate it. The inspector approached Karen's front door and knocked. It took nearly a full minute before she opened it, and when she saw who it was, her face twisted into an expression of barely concealed annoyance. Can I help you? She asked, her voice clipped. We're here on behalf of the energy provider to conduct an inspection of your solar system, the inspector said. We've identified potential safety issues with the installation, and we need to verify compliance. Karen crossed her arms. I don't recall requesting an inspection. This isn't optional, the inspector said firmly. If we find any unauthorized modifications to your system, we have the authority to disable the connection. Karen hesitated, glancing past the inspector to where Jeremy stood watching. He could see the calculation in her eyes. She was trying to figure out whether she could talk her way out of this. But the inspector wasn't budging. Finally, with obvious reluctance, she stepped aside and let them in. Jeremy didn't need to stick around for the rest. He knew what would happen next. The energy company would confirm that the system was unauthorized, and they would shut it down. Karen would be left with a useless set of stolen panels that she couldn't legally use or sell. And with the insurance claim moving forward, it was only a matter of time before she had to face the consequences. He went back inside, letting out a slow breath. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time since this whole mess started, he felt like he was finally gaining the upper hand. Jeremy knew Karen wasn't going to accept defeat quietly. People like her never did. The moment the energy company inspectors shut down the stolen solar panels, effectively cutting off the unauthorized power supply to her house, he expected retaliation. Look, he didn't have to wait long. That same evening, after the inspectors left, he saw Karen pacing in her front yard, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her expression twisted into something between rage and disbelief. She had probably spent the last hour making calls, trying to convince anyone to reverse what had happened. But there was no reversing it. The energy company had made it official, the panels were not hers, they were illegally installed, and they had been shut down pending further investigation. Karen had lost a battle, but Jeremy knew she would double down before admitting full defeat. The first sign of escalation came just before midnight. Jeremy was in his office, reviewing emails from the insurance company regarding the next steps in reclaiming his property, when his motion sensor alerts went off. His security system detected movement in his driveway. He immediately switched to the live camera feed on his phone, expecting to see Karen herself standing there in some last-ditch effort to intimidate him. Instead, he saw a different figure. A man wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face was crouched near his car. Jeremy zoomed in, his pulse quickening. The guy was holding something wire cutters. Jeremy didn't hesitate. He reached for his keys, slipped a flashlight into his pocket, and stepped outside. He made no effort to be quiet. He wanted the intruder to know he was coming. The second he stepped onto his porch, the man looked up, startled by the sudden presence of someone watching him. Hey, Jeremy's voice cut through the night. What the hell are you doing? The man froze for a split second before scrambling to his feet and bolting toward the street. Jeremy didn't bother chasing him. He didn't need to. The security cameras had captured everything. Instead, he walked over to his car and crouched down. The guy had been trying to cut the cables running to his external security cameras. He had almost succeeded. Jeremy exhaled sharply. This wasn't just Karen being petty, this was calculated. She had sent someone to try and disable his surveillance, to blind him before making her next move. He didn't know whether the guy had been planning to vandalize his property or if this was just a warning, but it didn't matter. The message was clear. He wasn't going to wait around for the next escalation. He went back inside, pulled up the footage, and immediately sent it to the local police department. His previous report about the attempted break-in had been acknowledged but not acted on aggressively. This time he had clearer evidence, someone caught in the act, a clear attempt at property damage, and an ongoing legal dispute that tied everything together. He also forwarded the footage to Lisa Carter at the insurance company. The more documented incidents he had on record, the harder it would be for Karen to paint herself as the victim when the hammer finally dropped. The next morning, he woke up to a knock at his door. When he opened it, 2 uniformed police officers stood on his porch. The lead officer, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a tired expression, introduced himself. "Mr. Wallace, we received your report about the attempted property damage last night. Do you have time to answer a few questions?" Jeremy nodded, stepping aside to let them in. He led them to his office, where he had his laptop set up with the security footage ready to go. He played the clip, showing them the intruder in full clarity. The officers watched closely, and when the video ended, the lead officer nodded. "This is clear evidence of attempted vandalism," he said. "You mentioned in your report that you believe this is connected to an ongoing property dispute?" Jeremy didn't hold back. He explained everything: how his solar panels had been stolen, how they had been relocated to Karen's house, how the energy company had shut them down, and how she had already attempted to tamper with his property once before. The second officer, a younger man, took detailed notes while the lead officer listened, his expression unreadable. "This woman," the officer finally said, "has she ever directly threatened you?" "No," Jeremy admitted, "but she's been escalating. And she's clearly getting desperate." The officer exhaled through his nose, thinking, "You've done the right thing by documenting everything. We can't prove she was directly involved in last night's incident, but it's clear that someone wants to interfere with your case. We'll file this as part of an ongoing investigation. And I'd strongly recommend you consider filing a restraining order." Jeremy nodded, already planning his next move. "I'll talk to my lawyer about that." By the time the officers left, Jeremy felt a small sense of relief. The police were finally starting to take this seriously. Karen wasn't just some annoying neighbor anymore. She was actively breaking the law, and the more she escalated, the more evidence piled up against her. That afternoon, Lisa called him. "You're not going to believe this," she said, sounding almost amused. "Karen's trying to file a counterclaim against you." Jeremy blinked. "For what?" "She's claiming that you're harassing her, that you're making false accusations, and get this, that you tried to sabotage her solar system out of jealousy." Jeremy let out a short, incredulous laugh. "She's actually trying to flip this on me?" "Oh, it gets better," Lisa continued. "Her lawyer sent a letter to our office this morning demanding that we drop your claim. They're saying that unless you retract your complaint, she's considering legal action." Jeremy shook his head. "She's bluffing." "Of course she is," Lisa said. "Her claim has no merit, and we already have a mountain of evidence proving that those panels were stolen from your property. But she's desperate, and desperate people do stupid things. Just be careful." Jeremy thanked her and ended the call, but the conversation left him even more determined. Karen was trying every trick in the book to wriggle out of accountability, but the noose was tightening. He checked his email and saw a new message from his lawyer, confirming that the demand letter had been formally sent to Karen. She now had 2 choices: return the panels and settle quietly, or face a lawsuit that would cost her far more than the stolen equipment was worth. That night, Jeremy double-checked all his locks and security feeds before heading to bed. He wasn't afraid, but he was prepared. Karen had already crossed several lines, and if she was willing to send someone to vandalize his property, there was no telling what she might try next. But he wasn't going to let her win. Not now, not ever. Jeremy knew the situation had reached its breaking point. Karen had tried everything: denial, manipulation, intimidation, but none of it had worked. The stolen solar panels had been shut down, the police had opened an investigation, and the insurance company had built an airtight case against her. Now, with legal action looming over her, there was only one move left for her to make: desperation. The day after Lisa informed him about Karen's ridiculous counterclaim, Jeremy received an email from his lawyer confirming that Karen had been officially served with the legal demand to return the stolen property. She had 48 hours to comply before they escalated the case to a full-blown lawsuit. He knew she wouldn't take it well. That evening, as Jeremy pulled into his driveway, he noticed something immediately off. The gate to his backyard was slightly ajar. He was sure he had locked it that morning. His stomach tightened. He killed the engine, grabbed his phone, and approached cautiously. As he pushed the gate open, he immediately spotted what was wrong. His breaker box had been tampered with. The cover was hanging open, and several of the wires had been deliberately cut. A slow, cold anger settled in his chest. This was sabotage. Karen, or someone acting on her behalf, had come onto his property and deliberately tried to mess with his electrical system. Whether they intended to disable his security cameras or just cause general damage, it didn't matter. This wasn't just petty revenge. This was criminal. Jeremy pulled out his phone and took several photos before stepping back inside. His house still had power. Whoever did this clearly hadn't known what they were doing. But this wasn't just about the damage. Karen was escalating beyond underhanded legal tactics. Now she was actively trying to cause harm. He wasted no time calling the police. When the dispatcher asked if the suspect was still on the property, he told them no, but made it clear that this was a direct retaliation tied to an ongoing investigation. Within 30 minutes, a squad car pulled up in front of his house. 2 officers stepped out, one of whom Jeremy recognized from the previous break-in report. "Mr. Wallace," the lead officer said, glancing at his notes. "Another incident?" Jeremy led them around back and pointed at the vandalized breaker box. "Someone came onto my property and did this while I was at work." The officer examined the damage, nodding slowly. "Whoever did this was sloppy, but they knew enough to target your electrical system." Jeremy folded his arms. "This is a direct escalation from my neighbor, Karen Mitchell. She's already under investigation for theft, and now she's resorting to this." The officer exhaled through his nose, clearly piecing things together. "We'll file this as further evidence in the ongoing case. Did your cameras catch anything?" Jeremy pulled up the security footage, but just like the last time, the intruder had come prepared. They had managed to avoid the main cameras, staying out of direct view. It was frustrating, but Jeremy knew it was only a matter of time before Karen slipped up completely. The officer finished his report, advising Jeremy to stay alert and document any further incidents. "With everything going on, I'd strongly recommend pursuing a restraining order," he added. "At this point, it's clear she's targeting you." Jeremy nodded. "Already in the works." After the police left, he made 2 phone calls, one to Lisa at the insurance company and another to his lawyer. Lisa assured him that every new incident strengthened their case. His lawyer, on the other hand, was far more direct. "We're done playing games," he said. "We're filing the lawsuit tomorrow. If she doesn't return the panels, we'll take her to court and make her pay far more than they're worth." Jeremy hung up, feeling something shift inside him. He had given Karen multiple chances to walk away, to return what she had stolen and avoid the consequences. But she had chosen war. Now she was going to lose. The next morning, things took an even more dramatic turn. Jeremy was sitting in his home office reviewing paperwork when a loud banging came from his front door. He stood up, already suspecting who it was, and when he opened the door, he wasn't surprised to find Karen standing there. What did surprise him, however, was how unhinged she looked. Her usual smug confidence was gone. She was furious, breathing heavily as if she had just stormed over. "You think you can do this to me?" she hissed. Jeremy kept his expression neutral. "Do what, Karen? Hold you accountable for stealing my property?" Her hands balled into fists. "You've ruined my life over some stupid solar panels. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Jeremy tilted his head. "Oh, you mean the lawsuit? The police reports? The fact that your stolen installation got shut down? Yeah, Karen, I know exactly what I've done." Her face twisted with rage. "You're going to regret this." Jeremy's patience snapped. He stepped forward, lowering his voice. "No, Karen, you are going to regret this. You could have backed off. You could have returned what you stole. But instead, you doubled down, lied, sabotaged my property, and tried to make me the bad guy. And now, you're out of moves. The police have everything. My lawyer has everything. The energy company has everything. You lost. Karen's expression flickered just for a second with something close to panic. Then, without another word, she spun around and stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her. Jeremy exhaled slowly. That was it. She had cracked. An hour later, he got a call from Lisa. She caved, Lisa said, amusement in her voice. Her lawyer just called. She's offering to return the panels in exchange for us dropping the lawsuit. Jeremy leaned back in his chair, feeling a wave of satisfaction wash over him. Not a chance, he said. She doesn't get to walk away from this scot-free. She returns the panels, she pays for the damages to my property, and she covers the legal fees. Otherwise, we take this all the way. Lisa chuckled. I was hoping you'd say that. By the end of the day, Karen's legal team had no choice but to accept. The alternative, a public lawsuit that would expose her theft and sabotage, was too great a risk. Jeremy watched from his front porch as a team of workers arrived at Karen's house to remove the stolen solar panels. She was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding inside, too humiliated to face him. The workers packed up the panels, loaded them onto a truck, and drove them straight back to the original installation company, where they would be properly reinstalled on Jeremy's roof. As he stood there watching everything unfold, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Karen had tried to take something from him, convinced she could bully and manipulate her way into getting what she wanted, but she had underestimated him. She had lost, and Jeremy, he had won. As the stolen solar panels were finally removed from Karen's roof and returned to their rightful place, Jeremy felt an overwhelming sense of closure. The battle had been long, frustrating, and far more personal than he had ever expected, but in the end, justice had prevailed. Karen had been backed into a corner with no way out, and for once she hadn't been able to manipulate or bully her way into getting what she wanted. Her arrogance had cost her everything. The day after the reinstallation, Jeremy stood in his backyard, watching as the workers finished securing the last of the panels. They checked the wiring, ran system diagnostics, and confirmed that everything was back in working order. As they packed up their equipment, one of the lead technicians approached him, wiping sweat from his brow. Everything's good to go, he said. You'll probably see some minor fluctuations for the next few hours while the system stabilizes, but you should be generating full power by tomorrow morning. Jeremy nodded. Appreciate it. And thanks for handling this so quickly. The technician gave a knowing smirk. No problem. Not every day we have to reinstall a system after a client's neighbor steals it. Jeremy huffed a quiet laugh. Yeah, it's been a hell of a month. As the truck pulled away, leaving him alone with his thoughts, Jeremy finally let himself relax. For weeks, he had been operating in a state of heightened awareness, always watching, always waiting for Karen's next move. Now there was nothing left for her to do. She had lost her stolen power source, she was being investigated for property damage, and she had been forced to cover his legal fees as part of the settlement. She had tried to outmaneuver him at every turn, but in the end her own arrogance had been her downfall. The neighborhood had taken notice. Word spread fast, and by the weekend Jeremy began to see a shift in how people interacted with him. Neighbors who had once been wary, hesitant to get involved in the ongoing dispute, were suddenly more open. A few stopped by to casually chat, subtly expressing their approval that someone had finally stood up to Karen. One couple even admitted that she had pulled similar stunts on them in the past, nothing as extreme as stealing solar panels, but enough to make their lives difficult. Karen, on the other hand, had gone silent. Her usual presence, the way she constantly hovered around her yard or made a point to inject herself into neighborhood affairs, had disappeared. She wasn't seen outside. No more passive-aggressive remarks, no more superiority complex. She had been publicly humiliated, exposed as a fraud and a thief, and now she was paying the price. It wasn't long before Jeremy heard the inevitable rumor Karen was planning to move. He didn't celebrate, but he couldn't deny the satisfaction that came with the news. It wasn't just about winning, it was about knowing that she had finally faced real consequences for her actions. She had spent years controlling, manipulating, and intimidating the people around her, believing she was untouchable. But now, after finally meeting someone who refused to back down, she had been forced to confront reality. 2 weeks later, the moving truck arrived. Jeremy watched from his porch as boxes were loaded up, furniture hauled out, and Karen's carefully curated life was packed away. She was leaving in the same way she had always lived, without saying a word to anyone. No apologies, no goodbyes, just an unceremonious exit. As the last of her belongings were taken away, Karen herself finally stepped outside. For a moment she stood there, staring at her now empty home. Then, as if sensing Jeremy's gaze, she turned her head and looked directly at him. There was no anger left in her expression, no superiority, no smugness, just bitterness. Jeremy didn't look away. He held her gaze, silent but resolute. This wasn't about gloating. It was about making it clear that no matter where she went next, she would never be able to pull the same stunt again. Karen lingered for a moment longer, then without a word she climbed into her car and drove away. The street was quiet in her absence. Jeremy exhaled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. The fight was finally over. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jeremy sat on his porch with a cold beer in hand. His solar panels, back in their rightful place, absorbed the last of the fading sunlight, silently converting it into power. Everything was as it should be. He had won. And Karen? She was nothing more than a bad memory.